Jack woke up to what he thought was the sound of a helicopter landing on his roof. His heart raced as he bolted upright in bed, half expecting to see searchlights piercing through his cabin windows. But no, it wasn't a helicopter. It was something far worse. He threw on a flannel shirt, stumbled out the door, and froze in disbelief. There it was, a chairlift. A chairlift, dangling smugly above his cabin like some sort of mechanical vulture. Steel cables stretched across the sky, and bright red chairs swayed lazily in the morning breeze. As if that weren't bad enough, one of those chairs was currently carrying a man in neon ski gear who had the audacity to wave at Jack like they were old friends. "Morning, neighbor," the man shouted cheerfully. Jack didn't wave back. Instead, he stared, slack-jawed, as another chair passed by, this one carrying a couple taking selfies with his cabin in the background. "What the hell?" Jack muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the low hum of machinery and the distant chatter of tourists floating overhead. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of nightmare brought on by too much whiskey and not enough sleep. But no amount of blinking or pinching himself made the chairlift disappear. It was there, as real as the mug of coffee he'd dropped onto the porch in shock. Jack's cabin was supposed to be his escape from civilization. A quiet retreat nestled in the Colorado mountains where he could fish, read books, and avoid people altogether. He'd spent 10 years building a life here. A life that didn't involve strangers gliding over his roof like they were on some kind of ski resort safari tour. He squinted at the chairlift's path and realized it wasn't just over his cabin. It was directly over his cabin. The steel towers supporting it had been planted so close to his property line that he could practically touch them if he reached out far enough. How had this happened? How had something so absurd and invasive been built without him noticing? And then it hit him, the HOA. Jack groaned loudly enough to scare off a squirrel that had been nibbling on a pine cone nearby. Of course it was the HOA, the Homeowners Association, that shadowy cabal of clipboard-wielding busybodies who seemed to exist solely to make everyone's lives miserable. Jack had avoided their meetings like the plague ever since moving here, figuring that as long as he paid his dues and didn't paint his cabin neon pink, they'd leave him alone. Clearly, he'd underestimated their capacity for chaos. Storming back inside, Jack grabbed his laptop and started digging through old emails from the HOA. Sure enough, buried deep in an email with the subject line, "Exciting community improvements coming soon," was a single sentence about the installation of an innovative chairlift system to enhance neighborhood connectivity. Enhance neighborhood connectivity? Jack didn't even know what that meant. He lived here specifically because he didn't want to be connected to anyone. And how had they managed to build this monstrosity without him noticing? He scrolled further down and found the answer. Construction had taken place during the 2 weeks he'd been visiting his sister in Oregon last month. They'd timed it perfectly, like burglars waiting for the homeowner to go on vacation before breaking in and rearranging all their furniture just for fun. Jack's blood boiled as he read through more HOA correspondence filled with corporate buzzwords like community engagement and shared experiences. Shared experiences? What part of having strangers drop candy wrappers onto his roof was supposed to be a shared experience? He picked up his phone and dialed Karen, the president of the HOA and self-appointed queen of passive-aggressive emails. "Karen," Jack said when she answered, trying to keep his voice calm despite wanting to scream into her ear. "Can you explain why there's a chairlift running over my house?" "Oh, hi, Jack," Karen chirped in her usual tone that somehow managed to sound both condescending and overly cheerful at the same time. "Isn't it wonderful? The chairlift is our latest project to bring the community closer together. It's running over my house," Jack said flatly. "Well," Karen replied with a little laugh that made Jack want to throw his phone across the room. "Your cabin just happens to be right along the optimal route we selected. Isn't that lucky?" "Lucky," Jack repeated incredulously. "Karen, I didn't agree to this. You can't just build something like this without asking me first." "Oh, but we can," Karen said sweetly. "It's all outlined in the CC and RS. Ah yes, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the HOA's sacred text that no one actually reads until it's too late." Jack vaguely remembered skimming through them when he bought his cabin years ago but hadn't paid much attention because they mostly seemed concerned with things like fence heights and acceptable shades of beige for exterior paint. He certainly didn't recall anything about chairlifts. "Karen," Jack said through gritted teeth, "are you seriously telling me there's a clause in those CC and RS that lets you build a chairlift over someone's house without their permission?" "Well," Karen said after a pause that suggested she was making this up as she went along, "not in so many words, but there's definitely language about community enhancements, and our legal team assured us this qualifies." Jack hung up before he could say something that would get him fined or worse. Over the next few days, things only got more surreal. The chairlift became fully operational, ferrying tourists who seemed blissfully unaware, or maybe just indifferent, to how intrusive it was. Jack couldn't step outside without feeling like an exhibit at some bizarre mountain-themed amusement park. One afternoon, as he tried and failed to relax on his porch with a book, a teenager riding overhead shouted down at him, "Hey dude, cool beard." Jack glared up at him but said nothing. What could he say? It wasn't like yelling at random teenagers was going to solve anything. But then came the trash. Empty soda cans, candy wrappers, even a half-eaten sandwich that landed with an unceremonious splat on Jack's roof one particularly windy afternoon. By day 5 of living under what felt like an airborne invasion force, Jack decided enough was enough, and so began his quest for revenge. Jack wasn't the type to let things slide. Sure, he'd ignored HOA emails for years, but that was because they were usually about things like approved mulch colors or mandatory mailbox inspections. But a chairlift over his cabin? That was a whole new level of HOA lunacy, and Jack wasn't about to roll over and let Karen and her clipboard-wielding cronies win. So, Jack did what any red-blooded American would do when faced with bureaucratic nonsense. He went straight to Google. He typed in HOA chairlift legal rights and hit enter, diving headfirst into a rabbit hole of HOA governance, CC and RS, bylaws, and legal precedents. Within hours, Jack's cabin looked less like a peaceful mountain retreat and more like the war room from The Big Short. Sticky notes covered the walls, printouts of legal documents littered the floor, and Jack sat hunched over his laptop like a man possessed. The first thing he learned was that HOAs operate under a set of governing documents called covenants, conditions, and restrictions, or CC and RS for short. These were supposed to maintain harmony in the community by regulating things like landscaping and property modifications. But as Jack read deeper into his own HOA CC and RS, he realized something. They were vague enough to be weaponized. Karen had claimed the chairlift fell under community enhancements, a term so broad it could mean anything from building a playground to installing a roller coaster. The CC and RS didn't explicitly forbid chairlifts, but they didn't explicitly allow them either. It was a legal gray area, a loophole Karen had gleefully exploited to turn Jack's cabin into her personal ski lodge experiment. Jack wasn't just angry, he was inspired. If Karen could twist the CC and RS to justify her chairlift, then Jack could use those same rules against her. He began combing through every clause, looking for anything that could work in his favor. And then he found it, a section on nuisance. According to the CC and RS, homeowners had the right to live free from excessive noise, visual obstructions, or other disturbances that interfere with the enjoyment of their property. Well, if strangers waving at him from above while dropping sandwich wrappers onto his roof didn't qualify as a nuisance, Jack didn't know what did. Armed with this newfound knowledge, Jack decided it was time to confront Karen directly. He emailed her with the subject line, "Chairlift Violation Nuisance Clause." The email was polite but firm. Jack wasn't about to let Karen accuse him of being unneighborly. He outlined how the chairlift violated the nuisance clause and demanded its immediate removal. Karen's reply came faster than Jack expected. "Dear Jack, thank you for your email. We appreciate your concerns regarding the chairlift. However, our legal team has reviewed the CC and RS and determined that the chairlift does not constitute a nuisance under HOA guidelines. We believe it enhances community connectivity and provides valuable recreational opportunities for residents and visitors alike. Best regards, Karen, HOA President." Jack stared at his screen in disbelief. Community connectivity? Recreational opportunities? Karen made it sound like she'd installed the chairlift as an act of charity instead of an act of tyranny. But Jack wasn't done yet. The Karen wanted to play hardball, so could he. He began researching HOA lawsuits, cases where homeowners had successfully challenged their associations over unreasonable decisions. He found stories of people suing HOAs for everything from denying architectural requests to failing to maintain common areas. One particularly satisfying Reddit thread detailed how someone had sued their HOA president, also named Karen, and won so decisively that she was banned from running for office for 10 years. Jack learned that HOAs often relied on intimidation tactics, threatening fines or lawsuits, to keep homeowners in line. But when homeowners fought back with solid legal arguments, HOAs often crumbled under pressure. The key was documentation. Jack needed evidence that the chairlift was causing harm to his property value and quality of life. So Jack got to work gathering proof. He took photos of trash littering his yard, empty soda cans, candy wrappers, even an entire ski glove someone had dropped from above. He recorded videos of tourists shouting down at him as they passed overhead, including one particularly obnoxious guy who yelled, "Nice cabin. Bet you don't have Wi-Fi." Jack even measured the decibel levels of the chairlift's machinery using an app on his phone. Next, he started talking to neighbors, people who might also be annoyed by Karen's latest enhancement. Most were sympathetic but hesitant to get involved. Nobody wanted to be on Karen's bad side. However, one retired couple named Bob and Linda agreed to help after Jack showed them photos of trash piling up in his yard. "This is outrageous," Linda said as she examined a photo of a sandwich splattered on Jack's roof. "What if someone drops something dangerous next time?" Bob nodded solemnly. "I'll bet this thing lowers property values too." With Bob and Linda on board as witnesses, Jack felt ready to escalate things further. He filed an official complaint with the HOA board, not just Karen but all 5 members, and requested an emergency meeting to discuss the chairlift's impact on his property rights under the nuisance clause. The meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later at the community center, a beige building that smelled faintly of mildew and bad coffee. When Jack arrived carrying a folder full of evidence and accompanied by Bob and Linda for moral support, he expected resistance from Karen and her allies on the board. What he didn't expect was Karen walking into the room wearing a ski jacket emblazoned with the HOA logo. "Well," she said brightly as she took her seat at the head of the table, "let's get started. I'm sure we can resolve this amicably." Jack resisted the urge to laugh out loud. The meeting began with Karen giving a speech about how much positive feedback she'd received about the chairlift. Feedback that conveniently ignored every complaint Jack had filed. When it was finally Jack's turn to speak, he laid out his case methodically. Photos of trash littering his yard, videos of tourists shouting down at him, decibel readings proving excessive noise levels, testimonials from Bob and Linda about declining property values, all tied back to specific clauses in the CC and RS. By the time he finished speaking, even some board members looked uncomfortable. Karen tried to dismiss his evidence as anecdotal, but faltered when Bob pointed out that several other neighbors had privately expressed concerns about privacy violations caused by riders peering into their yards. The meeting ended without resolution. Karen insisted she needed more time to consult with their legal team, but Jack left feeling victorious nonetheless. He knew one thing for sure: Karen might have underestimated him once, but she wouldn't make that mistake again. Jack left the HOA meeting feeling like he'd just gone 12 rounds with a particularly smug boxer. Karen had dodged every punch he threw, deflecting his evidence with vague promises about consulting the legal team and exploring community feedback. It was infuriating. She hadn't admitted fault, hadn't promised to take down the chairlift, and hadn't even apologized for the sandwich incident. But Jack wasn't defeated, he was just warming up. The thing about Jack was that he wasn't a quitter. He was stubborn to the core, the kind of guy who once spent 3 days trying to fix a broken lawnmower instead of just buying a new one. And now, with Karen and her chairlift nonsense, that same stubborn streak kicked into high gear. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, Jack would play dirtier. That night, Jack sat at his kitchen table with a notebook and a pen, brainstorming ideas for how to fight back. He considered filing a lawsuit, But after Googling cost of suing HOA, he quickly realized that taking Karen to court would probably bankrupt him before he even got to opening statements. He thought about rallying more neighbors to his side, but most of them were either too scared of Karen or too apathetic to care. No, Jack needed something creative, something that would hit Karen where it hurt without landing him in jail or debt. And then it hit him: sound. The chairlift might have been an eyesore, but its real power lay in its ability to disrupt Jack's peace and quiet. The constant hum of machinery, the chatter of tourists, the occasional whoop from some adrenaline junkie. It was like living next to an amusement park. So Jack figured if sound was the weapon Karen had chosen, then sound would be the weapon he used to strike back. The plan was simple. Jack would install speakers on his roof, big ones, the kind you'd find at a rock concert, and use them to blast audio that made it sound like the chairlift was falling apart. He envisioned creaking metal beams, snapping cables, and panicked screams echoing through the mountains every time someone rode overhead. It would be terrifyingly realistic and hilariously petty, a perfect combination. Jack spent the next few days preparing for his revenge. He ordered 4 industrial-grade speakers online and spent hours watching YouTube tutorials on how to set them up without frying his electrical system. He downloaded sound effects from websites with names like frescarisounds.com and ultimatedisastereffects.net. By the end of the week, he had compiled an audio masterpiece. Groaning metal that sounded like it was seconds away from collapse, followed by loud snapping noises and blood-curdling screams. It was so convincing that even Jack felt uneasy listening to it. Setting up the speakers was no small task. Jack climbed onto his roof with a toolbox and a headlamp, muttering curses under his breath as he drilled holes and ran wires through his attic. At one point, he dropped a screwdriver onto his neighbor Bob's yard, prompting Bob to shout up at him, "What are you doing up there? Taking back my property rights?" Jack yelled back. Bob nodded approvingly and went back inside. By Saturday morning, everything was ready. The speakers were mounted securely on Jack's roof, wired into a control panel in his living room where he could play audio clips at will. Jack tested the system by blasting a few seconds of creaking metal while standing outside, just enough to make Linda peek out her window with a concerned look on her face. "It's perfect," Jack said to himself with a grin. And then came Sunday, the busiest day for chairlift riders. Families with kids, couples on romantic getaways, groups of college students looking for adventure. They all flocked to the chairlift like moths to a flame. By noon, there was a steady stream of people gliding over Jack's cabin, laughing and chatting as if they weren't invading his personal space. Jack waited until the first group passed directly overhead before hitting play on his control panel. The sound started softly, a low groan of metal bending under pressure. Then came louder creaks and cracks, followed by what sounded like cables snapping violently. Finally, there were screams, panicked cries that echoed through the mountains like something out of a disaster movie. Jack watched from his porch as chaos unfolded above him. The first group froze in their chairs, gripping the safety bars tightly as their heads darted around in confusion. One man shouted something unintelligible while another woman clutched her chest like she was having heart palpitations. By the time they reached the next tower and realized they weren't actually plummeting to their deaths, they looked pale enough to pass for ghosts. Jack couldn't stop laughing. Over the next hour, Jack played variations of his audio masterpiece every time a new group passed overhead. Some riders screamed. Others clung desperately to their chairs. One particularly dramatic teenager shouted, "We're gonna die!" loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. By mid-afternoon, word had spread among riders that something was wrong with the chairlift, but nobody could figure out what. Karen showed up around 3 p.m., wearing her signature ski jacket and looking thoroughly annoyed. "Jack!" she shouted from below as she spotted him on his porch. "What is going on here?" "Just enjoying my Sunday," Jack replied innocently. Karen stomped up his driveway like she owned it, which she probably thought she did, and glared at him. "We've been getting complaints about strange noises coming from your property," she said accusingly. "Strange noises?" Jack repeated with mock surprise. "You mean like, I don't know, trash falling from your chairlift?" Karen's face turned redder than her ski jacket. "This is harassment," she snapped. You need to stop whatever you're doing immediately. Harassment, Jack said with a laugh. Karen, I'm just exercising my right to enjoy my property, free from nuisance. Karen opened her mouth to argue but closed it again when she realized she didn't have a good comeback. Jack leaned against his porch railing and smiled smugly as Karen stormed off toward her car. By evening, riders had dwindled down to almost nothing, most too scared or annoyed by the mysterious sounds coming from Jack's cabin roof. As far as Jack was concerned, it was mission accomplished. He poured himself a whiskey and sat back in his favorite chair by the fireplace, savoring not just the drink, but also sweet victory over Karen's absurdity. For once in weeks, it was quiet again. By Monday morning, Jack's cabin had become the talk of the neighborhood, and not in the way Karen liked. The chairlift riders were spooked, HOA members were furious, and Karen was probably on her third cup of chamomile tea trying to calm her nerves. Jack, on the other hand, was feeling pretty good about himself. He'd spent Sunday evening basking in the glory of his success, sipping whiskey by the fire while imagining Karen's face every time someone complained about the haunted chairlift. But Jack knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to back down easily. She was the kind of person who'd argue over a 2-inch discrepancy in lawn height if it meant asserting her authority. Sure enough, by mid-morning, Jack heard the unmistakable sound of Karen's Subaru crunching up his gravel driveway. He peeked out the window and saw her marching toward his porch with a folder in hand and a look that could curdle milk. Jack opened the door before she could knock. "Karen," he said cheerfully, "what brings you to my humble abode?" Karen didn't waste time on pleasantries. She thrust the folder into Jack's hands and said, "This is a formal cease and desist letter from the HOA." Jack raised an eyebrow as he flipped through the pages. It was filled with legal jargon about disruptive behavior, intentional interference with community operations, and, his personal favorite, creating an unsafe environment for recreational activities. Karen had clearly spent all night drafting this masterpiece of passive-aggressive litigation. "Wow," Jack said, pretending to be impressed. "You really went all out with this." Karen crossed her arms. "You need to remove those speakers immediately or face fines and possible legal action." Jack leaned against the doorframe and smirked. "Karen, I'm just exercising my right to enjoy my property free from nuisance. Isn't that what the CC and RS say?" Karen's face turned redder than a ripe tomato. "The chairlift is not a nuisance." "Oh, I beg to differ," Jack said, holding up his phone. He played one of his videos from Sunday, a group of riders screaming as they heard the sound effects of snapping cables and collapsing metal beams. Karen winced as she listened. "This is harassment," she snapped. "No, Karen," Jack said calmly. "This is art." Karen glared at him for a long moment before snatching the folder back and stomping off toward her car. Jack watched her leave and chuckled to himself. He knew she'd be back. Karen wasn't going to let this go without a fight, but Jack wasn't worried. He had read every page of the CC and RS, studied nuisance laws, and even consulted Bob, who claimed he once took a law class at community college. As far as Jack was concerned, he was untouchable. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. Karen sent more letters, each one angrier than the last, threatening fines, lawsuits, and even HOA-mandated property inspections. Jack responded by cranking up his speaker system every time riders passed overhead, adding new sound effects like groaning wood and distant explosions for extra drama. By Wednesday afternoon, Karen showed up with reinforcements. 2 HOA board members named Steve and Diane, who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else but here. "Jack," Karen began in her most authoritative voice, "we're here to resolve this issue once and for all." "Great," Jack said brightly. "I've been waiting for you to take down that chairlift." Karen ignored him and gestured toward Steve and Diane. "We've decided to conduct an inspection of your property to ensure compliance with HOA regulations." Jack blinked at her. "An inspection? For what?" "For any violations," Karen said vaguely. Jack couldn't help but laugh. "Violations? Karen, my cabin is spotless. My lawn is mowed. My mailbox is regulation beige. What are you even looking for?" Karen didn't answer. She just marched past him into his yard with Steve and Diane trailing behind like reluctant sheep. For the next hour, they wandered around Jack's property taking notes on everything from his firewood stack, too tall, to his garden hose, not properly coiled. Steve looked embarrassed. Diane looked bored. Karen looked like she was having the time of her life. When they finally finished their so-called inspection, Karen handed Jack another letter outlining all his alleged violations and demanding immediate action. "This is ridiculous," Jack said as he skimmed through it. "Unsecured trash bins? Karen, I don't even own trash bins." "It's all in the report," Karen said smugly. Jack shook his head in disbelief but didn't argue further. He knew what this was: retaliation for his speaker stunt. Karen couldn't win on legal grounds, so she was trying to bury him in petty complaints instead. But Jack wasn't about to let her win. Not now, not ever. The next morning, Jack decided it was time to take things up a notch. If Karen wanted war, she'd get war. He spent hours researching public nuisance laws and HOA accountability cases online before drafting a formal complaint against Karen herself. Not just as HOA president, but as an individual homeowner violating community harmony through reckless decision-making, i.e., building a chairlift over someone's house. He cited specific clauses from the CC and RS about transparency, fairness, and respect for property rights, all backed up by evidence from his videos and photos. Then he sent copies of his complaint to every member of the HOA board, including Steve and Diane, and requested an emergency meeting to discuss removing Karen from her position as president due to gross misconduct. By Friday evening, Jack received an email confirming that his request had been approved. The meeting would take place next week at the community center. Jack smiled as he read it. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice. And justice, well, it sounded pretty good right about now. The day of the emergency HOA meeting arrived, and Jack was ready. He'd spent the past week preparing like he was about to argue a case in front of the Supreme Court. His evidence was meticulously organized into folders. His talking points were rehearsed, and he'd even printed out extra copies of his complaint in case anyone, accidentally, forgot theirs. If Karen wanted a fight, she was about to get one. The meeting was held in the community center, a beige, soulless building that somehow managed to smell like both stale coffee and fresh paint at the same time. Jack walked in holding his folders like they were sacred texts, nodding politely at the handful of neighbors who had shown up. Most of them avoided eye contact, clearly not wanting to get involved. Except for Bob and Linda, of course. They gave him enthusiastic thumbs-ups from the back row. Karen was already there, sitting at the head of the table like a queen presiding over her court. She wore her signature ski jacket, because of course she did, and had a stack of papers in front of her that looked suspiciously like counterarguments. Jack smirked. Let her try. The meeting began with Karen calling things to order in her usual, overly formal tone. "Thank you all for coming," she said, glancing around the room with a tight smile. "As you know, this emergency meeting has been called to address a complaint filed by Mr. Jack Thompson regarding my actions as HOA president." Jack raised his hand. "Actually, Karen, it's not just about your actions as president. It's also about your actions as a homeowner who's been violating community harmony." Karen's smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. "Duly noted," she said through gritted teeth. She turned to Steve, who was sitting next to her looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Steve," she said sweetly, "would you mind reading the complaint aloud for everyone?" Steve cleared his throat awkwardly and began reading from Jack's document. As he went through each point, Karen's lack of transparency in approving the chairlift, her disregard for property rights, her refusal to address legitimate concerns. Jack watched Karen's expression shift from smug confidence to barely concealed annoyance. By the time Steve finished reading, there was an uncomfortable silence in the room. Karen broke it with a laugh that sounded more forced than usual. "Well," she said, "that certainly paints an interesting picture. But let's not forget that this chairlift was approved by a majority vote from the board." Jack raised an eyebrow. "A majority vote? Karen, you didn't even notify residents before construction started." Karen waved a hand dismissively. "It was all in the CC and RS." "Was it?" Jack shot back. He pulled out one of his folders and flipped it open dramatically. Because I've read every single page of those CC and RS. And nowhere does it say you can build a chairlift without consulting homeowners first. Karen opened her mouth to respond but hesitated when she saw Jack holding up a highlighted copy of the document. And let's talk about the nuisance clause, Jack continued, his voice rising slightly as he got into his rhythm. The CC and RS explicitly state that homeowners have the right to enjoy their property free from excessive noise or visual obstructions. Do you really think having strangers wave at me from above while dropping trash onto my roof doesn't qualify as a nuisance? Bob chimed in from the back row. Don't forget about the sandwich. Karen shot him a glare but didn't respond. Jack pressed on, flipping to another page in his folder. And then there's this little gem. Article 4, Section 3. All community enhancements must be approved by a supermajority vote if they significantly impact individual properties. Did you get a supermajority vote for this chairlift? Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. We consulted our legal team. That's not what I asked, Jack interrupted. Did you get a supermajority vote? Yes or no? Karen didn't answer. Jack leaned back in his chair and let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. Look, I get it, you thought this chairlift would be good for the community. But what you failed to consider is how it affects people like me who have to live directly under it. You ignored my concerns, dismissed my complaints, and now you're trying to silence me with bogus fines and inspections. He gestured toward Bob and Linda. And I'm not the only one who feels this way. Linda stood up and nodded emphatically. That chairlift is an eyesore. It's lowered property values across the neighborhood. Bob added, and it's noisy as hell. I can't even hear myself think when it's running. A few other neighbors murmured their agreement, emboldened by Bob and Linda's outspokenness. Karen looked around nervously, clearly realizing she was losing control of the room. Steve cleared his throat again and spoke up hesitantly. Maybe we should revisit this whole chairlift thing? You know, take another vote or something? Karen shot him a look that could have melted steel. But Diane, who had been silent up until now, nodded slowly. I think Steve has a point, she said thoughtfully. If enough residents are unhappy with it, maybe we should reconsider. Jack couldn't believe what he was hearing. For once, common sense seemed to be prevailing over Karen's iron grip on power. Karen tried one last-ditch effort to regain control. This is ridiculous, she snapped. The chairlift is already built. We can't just tear it down. Why not? Jack countered calmly. You built it without proper approval. You can take it down just as easily. The room erupted into murmurs again as more neighbors voiced their support for Jack's argument. Finally, Karen threw up her hands in frustration and slumped back into her chair. She looked defeated, a rare sight that filled Jack with immense satisfaction. Steve turned to Jack with an apologetic smile. We'll schedule another meeting next week to discuss next steps, he said diplomatically. Jack nodded graciously but couldn't resist adding one last jab. Take your time. I'll be here enjoying my property rights, free from nuisance. The week leading up to the second HOA meeting was nothing short of glorious for Jack. Word had spread across the neighborhood about his epic takedown of Karen. And suddenly, he wasn't just that guy with the cabin under the chairlift. He was a local hero. Neighbors who had never so much as waved to him before were stopping by to offer their support. Or, in Bob's case, a six-pack of beer and a firm handshake. Jack basked in his newfound fame, but he didn't let it distract him from the task at hand. He spent the week refining his arguments, gathering even more evidence, and preparing for what he hoped would be the final nail in Karen's coffin. He even printed out a few charts showing how property values had dipped since the chairlift was installed. Not that anyone needed convincing at this point. Karen's reign of terror was crumbling, and Jack intended to finish the job. When the day of the second meeting arrived, Jack walked into the community center like a man on a mission. The room was packed. More residents had shown up this time, eager to see how things would unfold. Even Steve and Diane looked more confident than they had last week, as if they'd finally realized they didn't have to live under Karen's thumb forever. Karen, however, was still clinging to her delusions of power. She sat at the head of the table with her usual stack of papers, but her ski jacket was conspicuously absent. Maybe she'd finally realized it wasn't helping her case. "Let's get started," Karen said briskly, trying to project authority despite the fact that half the room was glaring at her. "We're here today to discuss Mr. Thompson's complaint regarding the chairlift and determine whether any action should be taken." Jack raised his hand immediately. "Actually, Karen," he said with a smirk, "we're here to discuss whether your actions as HOA president violated community trust and property rights." Karen's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Steve cleared his throat awkwardly and gestured for Jack to speak. "Go ahead," he said. Jack stood up and addressed the room like a seasoned trial lawyer. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I think we can all agree that this chairlift has been nothing but trouble since day one. It's noisy, it's invasive, and it's turned my cabin into some kind of tourist attraction." A few neighbors nodded in agreement. "But this isn't just about me," Jack continued. "This is about all of us. About whether we want an HOA that listens to its residents or one that steamrolls over them in the name of community connectivity." He pulled out his charts and held them up for everyone to see. "Here's what happened to property values after the chairlift went up," he said. "And here's what happened to noise levels in the area." Linda chimed in from the back row. "Don't forget about the trash." "Thank you, Linda," Jack said with a nod. "And yes, let's not forget about the trash." Karen tried to interject, but Jack held up a hand to stop her. "Karen," he said calmly, "you've had your chance to explain yourself. Now it's my turn." He laid out his case methodically. How Karen had ignored proper procedures when approving the chairlift. How she'd dismissed legitimate concerns from residents. How she'd retaliated against him with bogus inspections when he dared to speak up. By the time he finished speaking, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that Karen had overstepped her bounds. Steve glanced nervously at Diane before addressing the room. "Well," he said hesitantly, "I think it's clear we need to take another vote on this chairlift, and on Karen's role as president." Karen shot him a look that could have melted steel. "You can't be serious," she snapped. "I'm very serious," Steve replied firmly. The vote was quick and decisive. By an overwhelming majority, the residents voted to dismantle the chairlift and remove Karen from her position as HOA president. Jack couldn't resist a victorious grin as Karen gathered her papers and stormed out of the room without another word. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity as contractors arrived to dismantle the chairlift piece by piece. Jack watched from his porch with Bob and Linda by his side, enjoying every satisfying moment as his cabin reclaimed its peace and quiet. When the last tower was finally removed, Jack decided it was time to celebrate properly. He hosted a party at his cabin, a tongue-in-cheek affair with a theme he called the collapse of connectivity. Neighbors showed up in droves, bringing food, drinks, and plenty of jokes about Karen's downfall. Jack even set up his speakers one last time, not for revenge this time, but for entertainment. He played clips of creaking metal and snapping cables while everyone laughed and toasted to victory. As Jack stood on his porch looking out at his happy neighbors, and at his now unobstructed view of the mountains, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He'd fought back against HOA tyranny and won. And while he knew there would always be another Karen lurking somewhere in the world, he also knew he'd be ready for her when she showed up. So that's it. That's how Jack took down a chairlift and an HOA president in one fell swoop. If you've ever dealt with an overbearing HOA or felt like your voice wasn't being heard, let this story be your inspiration. Sometimes all it takes is a little creativity, and maybe some speakers blasting disaster sounds, to remind people who really owns your property. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, comment below with your own HOA horror stories, and subscribe for more tales of revenge done right.